Association, and welcome to our 2016 series of webinars on war-related trauma. And welcome especially because this is Veterans Day and this is our Veterans Day presentation. These lectures are brought to you by the Service Members and Veterans Initiative of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Now, last year we presented a series of webinars that provided a wide arc through the considerable psychoanalytic contributions to understanding war-related distress and trauma. This year we'll focus on single author contributions. In addition to 3 webinars scheduled for this fall, we'll have an additional 3 in the spring. Now tonight we have 3 speakers. Our first is going to be Dr. Norman, also known as Mike Camp. Dr. Camp served in Vietnam from October 1970 to October 1971 as a psychiatrist and commanding officer of the 98th Neuropsychiatric Medical Specialty Attachment. Before going to Vietnam, he completed his medical internship at Letterman Army Hospital in San Francisco and a psychiatry residency at Walter Reed General Hospital in Washington, D.C. After his return, he completed child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship training at the University of California, San Francisco, and psychoanalytic training with the Baltimore-Washington Institute for Psychoanalysis. And Dr. Camp also served with the Army as a chief of psychiatry at a hospital in Germany, chief of the community mental health activity at a post in the United States, and as a member of the teaching faculty at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Dr. Camp retired from the Army as a colonel in 1988 and relocated to Richmond, Virginia, where in addition to maintaining an active practice of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, he focuses on the education and training of the next generation of psychiatrists as clinical professor of psychiatry at the Medical College of Virginia at Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Camp will be discussing selected aspects of his recently released book, which is quite fabulous, U.S. Army Psychiatry in the Vietnam War, New Challenges in Extended Counterinsurgency Warfare, which was published by the Army Medical Corps. Dr. Camp.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to my humble office. This is a new experience for me doing a webinar, so please bear with me. I'm delighted to be talking about Vietnam. I'm especially delighted to be talking about it on Veterans Day, and very pleased that I was invited to do so. In that regard, I want to give a shout out to all the veterans and active service members for this holiday. I also want to thank Dr. Shelby very much for all the time and effort that's gone into having this webinar series. I believe it's very important for us to teleconference as often as we can because it's so hard to get together and put our minds together. Vietnam has special meaning for me because I served there, but also I've been intrigued in the now, I wasn't there 50 years ago, but it's 50 years since we started the war there. I've been especially astonished how much people don't really want to talk about what happened in Vietnam. They often want to talk about veterans, and of course the first thing out of their mouth is about PTSD. I have my problems with that because it seems like it's boiled it down to a concept, a construct, which I don't think fits as many veterans as it may seem on the surface. In any event, what I'd like to do is go through some of the information that I gleaned from putting this book together. It took me, in fact, several decades to do this, and I guess it'll become apparent why that was such a challenge. So if I might start. By the way, I was not paid to write the book. I get no payment for book sales. It's free through the Army website, and I invite you to download it. Here's the information. I'll leave it on the screen for just a bit longer down the lower right-hand corner. In any event, the overall goal for the book was to create a permanent record of the impact of the Vietnam War on those sent to fight there. The impetus was, as you heard, I was there with the 98th Neuropsychiatric Detachment during the drawdown phase. I was there in roughly year 5 of 8. and we were one of two definitive treatment facilities within the Army Medical Service in Vietnam. We were swamped with psychiatric and behavioral cases, and I'll say more about that as we go along. Following that, there was decades of Army disinterest in the matter. The methodology for the book was to assemble and synthesize all the surviving information that I could find, statistical, anecdotal, published and unpublished. And this got started in earnest when I learned that, in fact, the Army was not going to do its own study of what happened in Vietnam and had not maintained the records, case records, or even the records of the senior military psychiatrist in Vietnam after the war. Along the way, in 1982, because of the dearth of information, I set out to locate all the psychiatrists who served in Vietnam and put together a structured interview. I had a great and robust response to that. And so I ended up with a lot of information that I was able to approach statistically in many instances and fill in some of the blanks for what we were missing from Vietnam. The book offers a historical narrative regarding the intersection of morale and mental health in the theater, an exhaustive review of the literature and repository of selected unpublished reports and documents. Prologue summarizes my experience there. It also includes 60 individual case examples. And I need to highlight here that it was against policy to bring back case studies or case reports from Vietnam. And there was one psychiatrist who, in fact, defied the policy, brought back his entire year's worth of work, and offered it to me for the purposes of writing this book, for which I'm very grateful. The book also offers a report of the survey that I mentioned earlier of the psychiatrists who served in Vietnam. It profiles the accomplishments of noteworthy Army psychiatrists and other mental health personnel in Vietnam. And then finally, it offers a critique of government and military leadership, that is, that pertaining to the maintenance of morale and mental health in Vietnam. I can go to the rationale for Army psychiatry for the book itself. America is currently recovering from fighting two costly counterinsurgency wars in which the front was not defined, the enemy was everywhere and indistinguishable from non-combatants. The conflict was prolonged, victory was elusive, the home front's support became politicized, and troop exhaustion and morale became challenging. The growing requirements for mental health services for veterans of these wars became daunting and alarming. Effective treatments are urgently sought, but resources must also be devoted, or should also be devoted, to the study of their causality in order to protect those fighting in future wars. Also, a counterinsurgency war, Vietnam was similar to the more recent wars, although much larger in scope. But it was unique in being affected by a social revolution in America, which some have suggested was second only to that surrounding the Vietnam War. In fact, as an aside, one of my thoughts are perhaps the debacle of what Vietnam became was more of a product of a perfect storm of these things, these conflicting cross currents in American culture, which I'll get into a bit later, but that maybe it was unique. I'm not certain, but I don't think we can assume it is. What happened within Vietnam may be worth a closer look, despite the passage of time in pursuit of lessons learned that may present and help future applications. It also offers to improve the care of the roughly 250,000 surviving Vietnam veterans still in need of psychiatric care. The Vietnam War, a counterinsurgency, asymmetrical, irregular, bloody, low intensity, which refers to, and we'll say more about this, relatively lower casualty ratio to personnel in the theater, and protracted. It provoked widespread condemnation of the war and all who served in uniform. The psychosocial impact in the theater, what I'm referring to as a myth, low levels for psychiatric and behavior problems, roughly 12 to 16.5 troops, 1,000 troops per year. The reality, there was an unprecedented 4 times increase in novel psychiatric and behavior problems in the second half of the war, pervasive challenges to military authorities, sometimes violent, and rampant heroin use, a crisis which undoubtedly jeopardized combat readiness. I think of it as Vietnam as a war with two halves, and it pivoted around 1968 events, and I'll say more about those later. What I'm calling a good war, with in parentheses, in which the U.S. military was effectively fighting the enemy, followed by a bad war in which we were mostly fighting ourselves. Each half played out under uniquely military and socio-political circumstances with a different set of personnel and produced different mental health challenges. Post-war, what was found was great national agony and incalculable cultural after effects, ones that we may still not have emerged from. Professional reports from Vietnam that were spotty and skewed. The U.S. Army, including Army psychiatry, failed to study what went wrong. There were unanticipated numbers of symptomatic veterans. And finally, there was an embrace of the PTSD diagnostic construct, which was codified in 1980, that came to eclipse all other considerations regarding Vietnam. I'm not going to read all of these features on the right. If you want to take a minute to look at those, they may not surprise you. This is a map of Vietnam, in modern times. The South Vietnam was below this red line that was at the DMZ of the 17th parallel. And my unit was where you see this pink pointer here in Da Nang. As I said, our unit was one of two definitive psychiatric treatment units for the Army. The other one was down near Saigon. I've got in blue that, what our rationale was for fighting the war. And of course, it became increasingly controversial. And I'm not going to get into the politics of it all, but they have a great bearing on what the troops who fought in Vietnam felt about what they were doing. This is just a quick and dirty comparison of Vietnam with the wars that preceded it, 20th century wars in America. Each square represents 50,000 troops spread out over 6-month intervals of the vertical columns. And the casualties are the gray and black squares, 50,000 each. There's no way to do a comparable comparison to more recent wars because the figures are not individuals who fought in those wars, but they're people who were in the service during those wars. They were mobilized. Since there was not general mobilization for the more recent wars, it would have to come at comparisons from a different angle. This is very important. This is the distribution of the 2.6 million U.S. military personnel of all branches who were assigned inside of South Vietnam, that is, the so-called boots on the ground, over the 8 years. And the numbers in the surrounding, outside the circle, are in thousands of troops. So the manpower, what this makes clear is the manpower requirements for each year, or for the war itself, are enormous. Just think about it. If we look at 1967, there's 485,000 U.S. military personnel in Vietnam. At the end of 1967, of course, it didn't work really like this. All of them went home to be replaced by 536,000 new people. Now, it's roughly estimated that 20% served more than one tour, but still the sense of it being a different war with different in each year, a different war with different individuals, with all that implies, or all the difficulties that brought with it, is huge to contemplate. Some more features: roughly 50% were conscripts in one way or another. The average age was much younger than World War II, which was roughly 26. The average age in Vietnam was 19. It can be estimated roughly that there were 650,000 so-called trigger pullers that's been disputed up one side and down the other. Some have thought as many as 8 support per combat personnel. As you may know, there were no reserves or National Guard units mobilized for Vietnam. Assignments were typically for 1 year. Okay, I said, yeah, okay, 1 in 5. Some general comments about combat exhaustion, combat stress reaction. You all are familiar with some of the terms in these earlier wars: shell shock, combat neurosis and fatigue, combat exhaustion, and then combat stress reaction and battle shock. Notice PTSD is not one of them. And I'm always surprised at how quickly people merge these as if that's what they were talking about. I think unless they make more adjustments in the DSMs with regard to PTSD, this distinction still is an important one. The classic combat reaction: acute, sometimes profound, combat stress-generated psychological regression. In other words, a situationally based mental and social decompensation. When treated early and effectively, remits within a couple of days without serious sequelae. Now, this is the mindset that we went into Vietnam with and seem to have been borne out by, of course, those enormous wars, high-intensity wars that had preceded it. Observable criteria for the diagnosis: stimulus, exceptionally stressful combat, and with the continued threat of danger. Predisposition distinctive by its relative absence, clinical course, rapid deterioration, combat effectiveness, presentation, symptoms of a disabling regression of psychological and social functions, prognosis, potentially reversible course when treated early and effectively. However, there's the potential for contributory intrapsychic conflicts, which I would argue are unique for the soldier, even over law enforcement personnel. He can be a woman now, of course, has been trained to kill the enemy as well as accept collateral damage, may become morally, ethically conflicted secondary to a lifetime of socialization not to kill. He may become motivationally conflicted as self-preservative instinct rises to the level that he opposes his sense of duty to perform. In other words, his sense of individuality is competing with his sense of being part of the collective. If he requires treatment, these conflicts may become further aroused because of his awareness that he is expected to recover and return to combat and face additional hazards. What this is a table showing what a distinguished group of American psychiatrists came back to America to present after they went over to Europe during the latter stages of World War II. They talked to many psychiatrists who had treated what would have been combat exhaustion cases and combat fatigue cases. And the yellow columns are the ones that that would have been designated as combat stress reactions. And I won't go through all of them, of course, but you can look at them yourself. The more dramatic ones, of course, are the more severe ones. The complete combat stress reaction: unstable, erratic, reckless, or overcautious; savage irritability, unreasonable and defiant, sobbing and screaming; passive and helpless; confused, disorganized, amnestic; stammering and incoherent, and so forth. It's been estimated that roughly 5% of the combat stress reaction casualties in Korea would have fallen into this complete category. This is my attempt to put a number of the features that people have distinguished as variables that influence a combat stress reaction casualty. and I borrowed Eric Erickson's model and George Engel's model. And of course, this is nothing but the biopsychosocial construct in American psychiatry. The most important feature that has been addressed over and over again is that of social support. If the soldier is feeling connected to his leader and to his combat buddies, then that seems to override just about everything else, or at least it certainly is the leading factor in helping him to withstand the combat stress itself. But notice there's also reference here to remote social support, and that's been more questionable over time. In other words, what is the soldier in the field? To what effect to him is it as to how he perceives the rationale for the fighting and what the people at home expect, what they value, and to what degree he is fighting for them. Vietnam is, as I mentioned earlier, is alluded to as a low-intensity war. If you compare Vietnam to Korea, you get, now these are wounded in action in this case, per number of deployed troops. You have almost 1/4 the intensity in Vietnam as it was in Korea, at least in 1950 in Korea. However, the distinguished military historian who had himself was served in Vietnam as a Marine wrote the following: men in maneuver battalions, the units that actually did the fighting, continued to run about the same chance of death or injury as their older relatives who had fought in Korea or in the Pacific. Indeed, during the first half of 1968, the overall Vietnam casualty rate exceeded the overall rate for all theaters in World War II, while the casualty rates for Army and Marine maneuver battalions were more than 4 times as high. So the low intensity part is very misleading. All right, let's look at combat intensity numerically. What we have here are, now this is all branches in purple, the number of deployed. These are the same ones you saw on the wheel with the different colors in the segments. And alongside of that in maroon, again, are numbers in thousands of casualties. Casualties here is killed in action and wounded in action. And what's important to note here is that not only do the numbers rise and fall, with 1968 being the pivot point, but also, if you notice, the combat intensity is rising. In other words, the ratio is getting higher and higher through 1968 when it begins to drop in 1969. So it's quite remarkably symmetrical. Now, also over in the upper right, you'll notice who was bearing the greatest burden of this. The Army was 67% of the military force was incurring 66% of the deaths. The Marines were overrepresented at 14% of the force, but 26% of the combat deaths. And the Air Force and Navy were considerably smaller, so the greatest burden clearly fell to the Army and Marines. So let's talk about stress on combat troops in Vietnam. What I have in the circles here are the number of troops who served within, again, on the ground in Vietnam, 2.6 million over the course of those 8 years, with 650,000 combat exposed troops. And here's the 47,400 hostile deaths. The casualties, 53% of all combat troops, at least of the 650,000, were either wounded or killed in action. Of the casualties, of the roughly 300,000 casualties, roughly half of them required hospitalization. The others were able to be treated short of that. Unique stressors in Vietnam, very young, conventionally trained, mostly conscripts, citizen soldiers, fighting elusive, determined insurgent guerrillas who utilize harassment, terrorism, and ambush and psychological warfare. They incurred episodes of extreme rigors, dangers, losses, or horrors while putting their lives on the line for the sake of the military objective and the welfare of their buddies. Individualized one-year rotations plus the command change every 6 months was a stress, as it turned out to be. The helicopter troop movements meant they could have more combat operations in a given time period than in earlier wars where they would have to get to the fight on the ground. The strategy utilized at least through the first half of the war seemed to be uniquely stressful, that of enemy attrition. The body count was the metric. They also had to witness widespread collateral damage and disrupted civilian lives. And they also had to bear America's rising anti-war passions while they're in fact fighting a war. There were questions raised, and these increased as the war went along with respect to excessive combat aggression or atrocities. Stress mitigators, overall low combat intensity, as I've mentioned, the enemy not capable of sustained precision and direct attacks. The enemy contact typically was intermittent and relatively brief. The troops enjoyed U.S. technical and medical superiority, including psychiatric care. The ubiquitous helicopters, which I mentioned earlier, were also invaluable for resupply and evacuation. And early in the war, the troops were able to have experienced leaders, but of course that changed as the war went on. And then the one-year tour, early in the war, it seemed to be a boon. Later in the war, seemed to work the other way around. So I've got some photographs that will illustrate some of these. I can't illustrate all of them, but I'll go through these quickly. This is an aerial photograph of the hospital where I spent the year. Our unit was over in a little corner of it, out of the main hospital. These units these photographs that flank those are division level mental health clinics that were manned by specialized personnel, psychiatry, social work, or specially trained medics. I'm going to try and go through this quickly. This is, again, I'm going to run through the years of the war and talk about everything that I could find that alludes to Kaiser Jones, who says he saw no combat stress reactions. Over on the right, you're going to see some of the division psychiatrists who at least describe them in publications. But for the most part, we're not able to give us incidence rates for combat stress reactions. In 1966, Army Hospital Bowman reports light combat stress casualty reaction incidents. Hospital ships psychiatrist, Navy psychiatrist Strange reports 15% classic and 25% pseudo combat stress reaction. So somewhere around 40% were in some way reacting to the combat. But what was important here is that the Marines did not have treatment capabilities on the ground, that is specialized treatment capabilities in Vietnam. So they had to evacuate people to these hospital ships, and it's very possible that this greatly skewed what he saw. Now again, we're on the blue column is the deployed personnel in the theater of all branches, and the maroon are the casualty rates. Most important here is that the researcher Bourne reports that combat stress casualties over 6 months throughout the theater represented 7% of all hospital admissions, which came out, though, to be just 0.66 per thousand troops per year. But again, that's at tertiary treatment facilities, doesn't give you the scope of the the incidence at the lower echelons of treatment. In 1967, we get a bit more information here. The senior Army psychiatrist sums up 2 years in Vietnam, says combat stress reaction cases have been infrequent and light, most managed by the corpsmen and unit physicians. A survey of Army MDs and psychiatrists by Johnson reports now we're talking about lower echelon care, 5.1 per thousand troops per year of combat stress reaction. If we put Bourne's, I extrapolate from Bourne's 1966 rate of combat stress reaction of 0.89, and I combine that with Johnson's 67 non-hospital combat stress reaction casualty rate, I end up with 6 combat stress reaction cases per thousand troops per year, which turns out to be roughly a quarter of the rate seen in Korea. Also important, as U.S. Air Force psychiatrist Hayes reports that now Travis is back in the United States, that there were 6.7% of psychiatric transfers from Vietnam that were 6% of the medical transfers from Vietnam were psychiatric. He found one combat stress reaction case among them over I don't remember the time frame exactly. Okay, and then Army psychiatrist Block sees 34 cases over 11 months, roughly 6% of their inpatients. So it's the same thing that Bourne was reporting back in '66. In '68, a great deal happened, as you've seen in Vietnam. The combat, we began the drawdown after 1968. I'll say more about some of the events at that time. But what's interesting is an Air Force psychologist in the Philippines does Rorschach testing on 1,500 psychiatric transfers from Vietnam over 2 years and finds 2 cases of traumatic neurosis. 69 is not much to report. In 1970, very important in that the medical experience in Vietnam for the entire war up to that point was summarized by Surgeon General Neal, and it makes no mention of combat stress in any regard, nor combat stress casualties in any regard. Quite remarkable. Furthermore, an official Army review of the Vietnam psychiatric experience by Kolbach and Parrish in the Army Surgeon General's office reports very low combat stress incidents with no specifics, and that combat stress reaction casualties were roughly 7% of psychiatric admissions. So it's holding steady at the same low rate that Bourne reported and that Hayes reported in the evacuations. There's nothing else that appears in 71 and 72. But what's important to highlight here is the Jones and Johnson post-war review of Vietnam psychiatry experience reports extremely low combat stress incidents. And then finally, the Army, as I said, Army destroyed or lost all psychiatric case records and the reports of the senior psychiatrists in Vietnam. So what else can we say about what the psychiatrist saw in terms of combat stress? The next two slides are results of my survey. This is what the percentage of each of the formal diagnoses, the psychiatrist in all the psychiatrists in the theater there were roughly 135 who served there, and I was able to capture, for the purpose of the study, 85 individuals' responses. And what you can say here is that roughly 1/3 each: psychosis and neurosis, character behavior disorder, and then stress reactions. However, if we split it out by two dichotomies, we get a little bit more information. These are up here, and these are the more important, statistically significant ones. Those who served before the middle of 1968 saw drug dependence at 8.1% of their caseload, and those who served later more than double that. And then with regard to combat stress reactions, not surprisingly, the combat psychiatrists, those who served exclusively with combat units, saw roughly twice as many as the hospital psychiatrists saw, who would have been seeing more of the support troops. So what did they treat? What did the combat psychiatrists treat? Well, I asked them a long list of possible symptoms or syndromes that they had to treat, and this is what I came up with. This is the top 10. For those of you who don't know, short timer syndrome is a kind of psychosocial withdrawal and irritability and unreliability seen among many troops as they approach the end of their tour. But what you can certainly agree is that these are on the light end of that table of combat stress or combat exhaustion symptoms that the panel of American psychiatrists came back from World War II, indicating that they found that the cases were demonstrating. So let's look at the forward treatment doctrine. Although these casualties may vary in their presentations, they typically have undergone, since they have typically undergone a reversible crisis, they can be clinically managed in a unitary fashion. The objective is to expeditiously both restore recoverable casualties in the service of winning the fight, actually, and to limit disability. And it was assumed that both of these would be accomplished through this treatment doctrine. Principal elements, and some of you are probably familiar with these: replenishment, simplicity, replenishment, wound care, reassurance, encouragement, and the very conservative use of psychotropic medications. Immediacy means you do it as rapidly as possible, as close as possible to the soldier's unit in the fighting, and especially important that the soldier is surrounded by all measure of expectation that he undergo a quick recovery and resume his duties. So what happened in Vietnam? This is just a rough summary. The low incidence of relatively mild symptoms served to eliminate concern that these kinds of casualties would affect the war's outcome. Field treatments roughly did coincide with the doctrine that I've just reviewed, and available data suggests favorable results comparing with Korea. Non-specialized treatment, this is the combat medics and general medical officers at the battalion level, effectively treated 63%. Second echelon care, specialized within the combat division, effectively treated 20%. Third echelon care, 15%. The guesstimate is the difference with Korea here is that helicopter mobility allowed many troops to be transported more quickly to higher echelons of care, and they probably overflew some of the first echelon care. Evacuated out of Vietnam for additional care, negligible. But that can be misleading, if you ask me. That is, the interpretation of the doctrine and the literature may have suggested to many to revise the diagnosis. That is, that when the individuals first brought in, they're considered to be a combat stress reaction. If by definition they don't recover within X number of days, they may have been re-diagnosed something else and therefore not not counted as combat stress, as chronic or intractable combat stress reaction cases. I'm not sure that's good or bad, but that may explain the figure. Regarding the principles I just went through, immediacy and expectancy were generally upheld. Proximity was probably reduced, as I said, by the helicopter mobility. Simplicity was dramatically altered by the widespread use of psychotropic medications. Maintenance medicines were commonly prescribed, which I'll show you, for soldiers as outpatients, including those in combat positions. Enlisted social work technicians were invaluable in their treatment, and mental health specialists, including the psychiatrists, were not typically involved in behavior and discipline problems of stress combat troops, like combat avoidance, excessive combat aggression, and so forth. So here's the one slide of many I have that just gives you an idea of the popularity of psychotropic medications in Vietnam by the psychiatrists and all the physicians for that matter. What we have with these 3 data points are, if this is an acute combat stress reaction who's returned to duty, might he be given Valium, Librium, Thorazine as an outpatient to take with him back in the field? All of these go up except the Valium. I don't understand. I think that must be an outlier for some reason. It doesn't make sense that it would be that different than Librium, but in any event, all of them go up. So the longer the individual was, his symptoms lasted, the more likely he was to get a psychotropic medication as he headed back to his unit. Of course, there he could be followed by the division psychiatrist, but how closely that would be is anybody's guess. So let's look at deployment stress. Stressors: great distance from home, hot, wet, relatively deprived, the gaping cultural divide, diffuse fearfulness of attack, daunting physical and topographical and weather-related challenges, racial tensions and conflicts, increasingly militant counterculture, youth revolution as a surround, rampant polydrug use, ambivalence regarding the military mission and leaders, anti-war movement at home. As far as stress mitigation, technical and air superiority, again, the places they lived and worked in were mostly safe. There were abundant diversions and distractions. There was rapid and sophisticated medical care, and there was, of course, specialized mental health care. And then finally, the one-year tour, early in the war anyway, was a boon. Some more photographs trying to illustrate some of these. Up in the right-hand corner, the troops, many of them had adopted pet dogs, stray dogs. Ha ha short is a reference to mocking other soldiers because this individual was closer to his date of return to the States. It's hard to illustrate the drug epidemic, but these guys over here are heroin dealers. This is intended to illustrate the shift in 1968, which I showed you earlier, where combat stress began to fade as an issue and theater stress began to mount as a problem. What happened if your history isn't that, if you're not up on your history that much, that's when the Tet offensives happened. That's when the Khe Sanh base, Marine base, was sieged by the enemy. The U.S. media declared the war unwinnable. Johnson stopped the bombing of North Vietnam to pursue peace negotiations. General Westmoreland was replaced as the overall commander, and we declared a shift in defensive strategy and that we would turn the fighting over to the Vietnamese. Still, after 1968, and that is in 69, 73, there were 21,000 more U.S. personnel who died. So quickly, some illustrative graphics. This is a shift in the Gallup poll. 1968, it crossed over between people thinking that it wasn't a mistake and Vietnam was a mistake. These are morale depleting stateside influences. Troops in Vietnam were increasingly affected by the radical, militant, liberal counterculture, civil rights movement, and racial polarization, widespread antagonism towards American institutions, especially the military, a spreading, often savage anti-war movement, an expanding youth drug culture. Over time, U.S. troops sent to fight in Vietnam came to question their purpose and resent the risk and sacrifices they were asked to make. This is the AWOL and desertion rates during the Vietnam era. Again, 68 seems to be an important point. This is worldwide of all branches. This is administrative discharges for maladaptive behavior from the military, all branches from 68 on. So I know we're about to run out of time here, aren't we? Let me switch to a couple of slides that I think will help finish this section off. This is showing the two slides that are somewhat similar but different in certain important ways. This is the Army battle. This is Army troops only. This is the Army battle death rate. This is the psychiatric hospitalization rate, and this is the psychosis rate. Over many decades, the psychosis rate has never changed from roughly this plateau here, 2 to 3%. It did seem to go up, but more importantly is the psychiatric hospitalization rate. And what's crucial to keep in mind here is this is unprecedented in at least prior military history for psychiatric problems to grow while combat stress or combat intensity falls. Now, this has got much more complexity to it. I had to use wounded in action rate to get a higher scale for this. This is the blue one is the psychiatric hospitalization rate you saw on the earlier one. You see now it's much more muted. But again, as combat intensity, this time measured by wounded action, starts to fall, we're continuing to see these metrics of psychological and behavioral conduct disturbances. What I also have down here is where the heroin market began. It absolutely did begin then. By that I mean heroin was not available until then. And ultimately, the Army had to hastily devise an evacuation policy to start medically evacuating heroin-dependent soldiers out of Vietnam. At this point here, 72, 1 out of 8 soldiers was being evacuated out of Vietnam for heroin dependency. Maybe I can finish with this slide then. This is my predictive pathodynamic model for soldier demoralization and disability for a dysfunctional military organization and for large numbers of symptomatic veterans. fighting a very long distance from home in a formidable, unforgiving physical environment amongst an exotic, ambivalent populace. The fight itself, irregular guerrilla warfare against determined, ruthless insurgents, elevated fear of random danger, risk and sacrifice are perceived by troops as unevenly distributed. Combat ops produce collateral damage and large numbers of refugees. As far as the personnel, the average citizen soldier is very young. The majority feel coerced to serve. Troops are drawn from a youth cohort opposed to military service and war. Most are trained as regular soldiers. The replacement policies, the individual one-year tours produce excessive turnover, interfering with commitment to the mission and interpersonal bonds, depleting the experience levels of the troops over time, and raising the level of pre-induction psychological susceptibility. By that, I mean to meet the induction manpower demands, the military is lowering and lowering and lowering its standards. And then leaders rotating every month from the field, which makes the churning, doubles the churning and the disruption to good military order and efficiency. The strategy itself, killing, in other words, search and destroy missions, kill ratio, and body count metrics versus pacification and territorial control. Powerful mind-altering drugs are readily accessible. The war is prolonged, the results ambiguous, and people at home become war-weary, believe the threat to the nation is not imminent enough to justify the costs. They condemn the war and the military, vilify those in uniform and veterans, and thus, for many veterans, their wartime killing, or even having cooperated with the military, comes to feel to them like they are guilty of murder. So I'm going to stop here. I think that's fair to what we agreed. I actually run a little over, I apologize. And see what happens next with questions or comments.
Thank you, Mike. Folks, if you have questions, just use the chat feature and I will forward them on to Mike. I know there's a lot of interesting data in there. I was formulating questions as we go, but I'm having trouble getting a hold of them. That early data set you had, was that asking psychiatrists in retrospect?
Yes.
How many cases they treated?
10 or more years after they served there, I asked them all the questions, dozens and dozens and dozens of questions.
And so it's an obvious question. The medical folks weren't keeping records, or they weren't counting back then?
Well, no. No, in the book.
Well, as a matter of fact, no. Okay.
Pardon me?
As a matter of fact, no. Is that what?
No, that isn't what I said.
Oh.
Indeed, they were counting. In my book, in one of the appendices, I have the requisite places for psychiatric casualties or patients to be designated by diagnosis within the hospitals. So the tragedy is it was all lost. All the counting that was supposedly done was either lost, destroyed, or something or other.
Wow.
That's why I set out to do the book. There was no way to get at primary data that would allow us to answer these questions in a more refined fashion.
Oh. From what you've observed, is record keeping improved? Is counting improved?
I would hope it has. It was still the computer age back then, just the very beginnings of it. There's no excuse in regards to technology why these counts weren't made. I don't know what they're doing nowadays. That's part of my problem.
Yeah, and it certainly seems my students' observation as we dug into this that after every war there's a buildup of knowledge, and then it moves to the back shelves of the library or gets tucked away or forgotten about. We have a new war, and it's like people have forgotten what was accumulated prior, and we start all over.
Well, and that was not the case with World War II, I guess, or World War One really, but World War II, we were exceptionally proud of our accomplishment, and we devoted a lot of resources. There's a great literature coming out of World War II as far as who did what, where, and how it worked out.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I tackle in the book is to talk about the necessity that we pre-plan for historical record keeping and the immediate gathering of this information afterwards. So I'd love to believe it would have an impact, but I'm certain this is certainly a case example of a tragic loss of information.
Yeah. I'm also curious, how were psychiatrists going over trained? What kind of training did they receive in terms of the existing literature on war neurosis, combat stress, the various things it's been called over years?
Well, there were roughly 23, I think, % of Army trained people who served in Vietnam. As psychiatrists, the other Army psychiatrists who served over there were all civilian trained. So that what they had were, the ones who came from the Army programs had a lot of what you're talking about. The ones who were trained in civilian programs probably had none of it. What they were exposed to was in an officer's basic training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. They would have gotten a couple of hours of a condensed summary of what those people felt it was necessary for them to know. It was real hit and miss.
Did you say 75% of the civilians?
I said, well, what did I say? 20, I think I said 23%. So that's roughly 75%, yeah.
Wow. We have a question from Carol Dudley. Is there a need for psychodynamic therapy groups for Vietnam vets?
I can't answer that. I'm in favor of group. I'm in favor of a group approach to this sort of thing, but I have not worked extensively with veterans, and I would generally commend it, but don't know what their history's been. I mean, they're constantly looking for the best and most efficient way to treat veterans, so maybe somebody else will know the answer to that.
Carol, what setting do you work in? Maybe we can flesh out her question a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd love to know more.
Carol's a private practitioner. Are you seeing veterans? Are you running a group or thinking about running a group? Or are you asking what's available in the VA system? Not sure exactly what you're asking. Carol's thinking of starting a group.
Okay.
Where are you located, Carol? Because while Carol's typing, I'm old enough to remember back in my 20s, that was the only groups offered at VA were basically psychodynamic groups. I had a bunch of friends that ran them.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case.
Hartford, Connecticut. Yeah, and it could be with a little networking with like the Soldiers Project or Given Hour, you could certainly get a group up and running. Could be a possibility. Do you, well, I was thinking, Mike, as I was going back, I keep playing with your data in my head. I was trying to hold on to it. Do you see at all any parallels looking at the data coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan Do you see any at all similarities between Vietnam and the current wars?
I wish I had an answer. Most everything I encounter is all PTSD, calculations. And as I think I indicated, I have trouble translating that to a real experience in wartime. I don't mean it has no applicability. I just mean that to me, it's a two-dimensional approach, and I need the three-dimensional picture of what people are undergoing and how they're managing it before I feel like I can make comparisons. So that's a long way of saying no, I don't know.
Okay. We have another question from Valentina. Did Vietnam soldiers receive any kind of psychological or psychiatric care after the war? Were you?
I'm not sure. I mean, it would be quite variable. If they stayed in the service, they would have, what the services provided wherever they were located, and that should have been ample. But there's a big problem, and I'm no doubt there was a problem back then as well, with this whole thing about stigma, about not wanting to acknowledge that you are having difficulty. As far as someone going into leaving the service and what kind of services they had, that they would probably turn most naturally to the VA. So that would be, how adequate that was. It would depend on location, I'm sure, to a certain degree. But by that I mean how accessible was it, and then what the staffing and all was. So it's a very qualified yes. It was available.
Well, all right then. Thank you very much, Dr. Camp.
My pleasure.
I'm a bit of a numbers guy, and I was really trying to drill in there and imagine, but it looks like you're the only tracking at this point from what went on, and that was from memory.
Yeah,
and it's pretty impressive.
Thank you.
And
I don't know. Can I interrupt you? I don't know how anybody who is participating tonight might correspond with me. But if there's a way to give them my email, I'm happy to tell them. I'm happy to answer any questions furthermore. But also, if they are interested in locating a copy of this book and so forth, I would make sure they knew how to do that.
Sure, we can send out an email, and I think we'll make sure they get your email and a link to the book.
Great. That'd be wonderful. Thanks again.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight.
Good.
So our next presenters are in the room. As we get things set up for them.
Anybody hear me?
We can. Hello, we have our next presenters up. And I will introduce them to you, and then I'll get out of the way and let them do their thing. Andrew Berry is a psychologist and psychoanalyst who practices in Saratoga County in upstate New York. Completed his graduate training at Harvard University Extension School, the Union Institute and University, and Forrest Institute of Professional Psychology. He completed analytic training at the William Allison White Institute in New York City. He works with adults, adolescents, as well as working clinically pro bono with veterans. And his co-presenter is Nate Emery. Nate enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1990 and served as an infantryman in Operation Desert Storm in Kuwait and Operation Restore Hope in Mogadishu, and several other missions. He was commissioned a Marine officer in 2002 and retired from the Marine Corps in 2012. Over his 22-year career, he served in every combat element of the Marine Corps, asset across 8 different occupational specialties. Mr. Emery holds a Master of Science in Management and bachelor degrees in Political Science, History, and American Studies. He currently serves as a Management and Program Analyst for the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. He has been affected by PTSD since 1991 and learning to live with its effects since 2009. He and his wife, Angela, have raised 8 children and more than a dozen foster children. You must have a very busy house, Nate.
We do.
It sounds awful quiet on your end for that many bodies in the house.
Yeah, they're on the top floor in the basement.
Okay. Well, I am going to turn it over to Andrew and Nate.
Can anybody hear me? Okay, all right. The way I've set this up is I'm just going to be reading a paper that I've delivered now, or we have delivered on 4 separate occasions. It's all of 7 pages long. I don't want to drone on and turn the thing into a lecture. It's a brief paper, and I'm hoping it will provoke more discussion and different questions. And when I get done with this, I will turn it over to Nate, who is my discussant. When I put this whole thing together, I thought to myself, instead of another analyst as a discussant, why not have one of the real guys serve as such? And I blew the idea past Nate, and it took him about a third of a second to say, where and when do you want me? And so far it seems to be reasonably well received. And with that, I will read, and then Nate will talk and we will answer questions. So here we go. In Freud's earliest writings on war neurosis, as it was then called, his first observations were those of a surviving soldier mourning the death of a brother in arms. I found this striking, as Freud does not initially speak of edible conflict, libido, or any other sort of interaction among id, ego, superego in these seminal writings. He speaks instead of how one friend misses another. And at its heart, this is an interpersonal perspective. My presentation today is on the interpersonal aspects of working with veterans, whereas the symptoms of war neurosis here in 2016 are known as post-traumatic stress disorder, a diagnosis more often associated with fear or with biological dysfunction. I draw upon my theory from my training at the White Institute, and specifically from Harry Stack Sullivan, who was a veteran himself, one of the Institute's eminent founders in his landmark work, The Interpersonal Theory of Psychiatry. To Sullivan, pathology exists because of pathology in the patient's relationships. No psyche exists in a vacuum, and in Sullivan's theory, even when alone, the totality of the patient's existence comes from relationships with those both living and dead. From the interpersonalist perspective, the symptoms of PTSD, while certainly glaring and present, are not quite as monolithic as in other paradigms, and certainly not as reductive as a mere collection of symptoms to be medicated and nothing more. Reworded, if we focus solely on the symptoms, on symptom relief of PTSD symptoms, we are at risk for missing entirely the deeper psychological meaning of PTSD. And I submit this meaning can be found in relationships with others. And deepest levels of healing cannot be attained without exploring these relationships. I would also submit that the interpersonal approach focuses on early relationships affecting current relationships. In other words, what's past is prologue. This is of significance analytically because a child's first relationships with caregivers are tantamount to being their first relationships with people in positions of supreme authority. And relationships with authority figures is the bedrock upon which the military does or does not function. Jonathan Shea, in his book Achilles in Vietnam, points out that the subtitle to the Iliad is The Rage of Achilles. And Achilles is incensed by the betrayal of what is right by his leadership. Shea points out that betrayal by a trusted military leader may be the most traumatic aspect of combat experience. I have often encountered veterans battling with PTSD symptoms who concomitantly are also reeling from years of deeply conflicted relationships with people in positions of authority. And the interaction between the two phenomenon can be thought of as an extreme illustration of psychological potentiation, highly analogous to chemical potentiation. In other words, mixing alcohol and barbiturates, and just how lethal this can be. To illustrate, imagine a child playing on a playground and skinning his knee. At best, we can hope that the child goes to a mother, a father, a nurse, or whomever, and the injury is not only attended to in a physical sense with disinfectant and a bandage, but also in a psychological sense, i.e., the authority figure making the child feel soothed and safe and not needlessly blamed for his injury. Now, what if the same injury occurs and the child is afraid to turn to an authority figure, or otherwise has no authority figure to turn to at all? There are many possibilities, of course, such as the child's injury either gets ignored or improperly attended to, not to mention the interaction between the child and caregiver, who could be cold, angry, indifferent, ridiculing, dismissive, or could exhibit any other negative emotion. These children will not only bear the physical scarring, but also the emotional scarring of such incidences in a cumulative sense. Through repeated, less than optimal experiences with authority figures, trust in self and the outside world is understandably eroded, if not completely obliterated. Now, what if this child grows up and is seeking a non-blood surrogate family because of coming from circumstances of abuse, or an unavailable parent, or not having parents at all, or caregivers? Already, when the child, now an adolescent, signs on the dotted line, takes the oath, and enlists, he or she is at risk for having the emotional makeup of someone who could have a very hard time taking orders from any kind of authority figure, no matter how capable. And what if the authority figure, in the form of either officer or enlisted superior, is either incompetent or abusive, especially during and after combat tours where the seeds of PTSD are sown? What if a combat veteran becomes increasingly symptomatic, as denoted by psychiatric criteria, while still on active duty? This can lead to disciplinary problems and puts the veteran at risk for, in some cases, less than honorable discharges. And I have had the Herculean difficulty of reaching many, but not all, of the veterans who have suffered such fates while on active duty, and who have experienced childhoods replete with neglect or abuse in my consulting room. And as a psychologist and psychoanalyst, I have to remember that I am an authority figure of sorts, along with active duty military and VA healthcare providers the veteran may have encountered before coming to see me. And often it feels like from the intake onward that I have been put on notice, that I will have to go to great lengths to earn their trust. In such situations, I've found that PTSD symptomology per se decreases in size and importance, in a matter of speaking, while interpersonal issues conversely increase, and markedly so. Veterans want to be heard and not judged, and unfortunately, many clinicians often do judge, and I have had to work through additional damage from this as well when I work with patients who have already had experience with clinicians who simply do not understand what they are dealing with. And this adds additional authority figures to an already long list of people perceived by the veteran as incapable or unwilling to help them in any other way than the path of least resistance via medications alone. Another phenomenon I have encountered along these lines are clinical experiences where there really is no relationship other than being interviewed for 15 minutes, being tagged with a diagnosis, and prescribed a medication. This process usually involves little to no eye contact, and I find there is no difference between this unfortunate occurrence and receiving inadequate attention to the skinned knee that I mentioned before. And by the way, I am in no way equating a skinned knee with PTSD. However, the relationships between the caregivers and the veterans in both scenarios can be appallingly similar. In both scenarios, hope for a successful outcome is left wanting, and being somehow further damaged is often understandably anticipated. And some patients may provoke it, perhaps as a test of their clinician or of themselves. I have often heard from veterans who have been on active duty for long periods of time, sometimes for decades, that part of them still feels the same age as when they went in, which offers us the idea of a psyche which retains aspects of being an emotionally immature 17-year-old combined with another aspect of being thousands of years old. In cases of combat veterans who have seen enough blood, gore, and death to last 1,000 lifetimes. To this end, Hans Lowald's idea of reparenting and analysis as what constitutes therapeutic action comes to mind. By this I mean that in addition to attempting to heal the profound levels of trauma and loss from childhood through combat, we are faced with veterans dealing with some emotional coping mechanisms on the same levels as those of teenagers, especially as they work through the interpersonal morass of issues with authority figures. Which authority figures can they trust? Can they come to grips with their own authority issues and have a better understanding of their own emotional immaturity and somehow work through it? Harkening back to my opening reference to Freud, the interpersonal nature of loss of brothers and sisters in arms must be addressed in treatment, preferably from the intake onward, as an issue of paramount importance. I have heard many combat veterans refer to losing their youth and innocence during their time of war and never being able to experience relationships the same way again afterward. And I suggest that along with losing one's youth and innocence, that the moment they lose a brother or sister on the battlefield, that part of them arrests developmentally as well. They are robbed of the opportunity to survive the war together, to maintain an unparalleled friendship afterward, and finally to grow old together. So when a deep emotional bond is violently disrupted by death, the image of the 17-year-old's mind is frozen in time dies on that day as well. And grieving becomes a lifelong process of survivor guilt and obsessional thinking, such as, what if I had done this or done that? Would he be still alive? Would they still be alive today? And as analysts, when we hear a veteran say to us, I lost my brother or my sister that day, while such a remark may be biologically untrue, in a psychical sense, it is absolutely and resoundingly true, as they depend on each other 24/7, 365 for their very lives, which are often saved many times over. And as we hear about their interactions with each other prior to the loss, countertransferential images come to us of boys and girls playing together, working together, scrapping occasionally with one another, and fighting the enemy together. Life afterward requires more will and drive to succeed and somehow bear this cross, post-trauma and loss. By this I mean Christmas is no longer merry, birthdays are no longer happy, and Memorial Day / Veterans Day festivities invoke all kinds of feelings, up to and including the 1,000-yard stare on the faces of the veteran who has seen more than he or she can bear and has lost brothers and sisters with whom to share and understand that burden. This journey begins as the new recruit is trained to essentially have no emotions because they are an impediment to mission completion. This suppression becomes ostensibly set in stone by combat trauma and loss, and the numbing effect that it has on the veteran who then takes it home. Paradoxically, many warriors believe they have finally become, quote, good at their job when they can no longer experience emotions when terrible things happen. This is summed up in the common expression among them that, quote, wasn't nothing. But those who have never been baptized by battle need to be careful not to take this denial of feeling at face value. Family members often experience this post-traumatic emotional deep freeze and distance most harshly and are at a loss how to deal with a different person than the one they once knew. Oftentimes, I have heard vets say they either cannot feel anything or that they are afraid of feelings and being overwhelmed by them. And so the emotional suppression continues. It's as if the returning veteran remains in combat mode, hypervigilant and expecting attack. And those who have known no war cannot relate to this. The only thing we can do is to create a latter-day holding environment of safety as outlined by Winnicott in his theory of the parent-child relationship. Perhaps we can understand trauma itself as an undoing of the holding environment, a peeling away of the entwined layers of interpersonal safety developed over the course of development. And from this perspective, we may be able to understand that the path forward is in a reweaving of that holding environment. And this requires new interactions and new interpersonal development. But isn't that a basic concept of all psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and for that matter, of all human growth? We will see in veterans deep scars of trauma and experience that heals and does not infantilize or re-traumatize. Lastly, I would like to invoke the idea of witnessing in our consulting rooms and the powerful effect that it can have on veterans once we have earned their trust. Many cannot bring themselves to tell what they have seen with anyone other than those they served with. Often this reflects the deep conviction that such events and the interpersonal experiences that resonate with them could not be believed, understood, or even accepted by anybody who wasn't there. That being said, occasionally I have worked with those who cannot live another day without finally being able to speak of their trauma out loud to someone. And I have been told periodically that I am the first to hear about it for whatever reason. And finally letting somebody else know goes a very, very long way to relieving intolerable pressure as a way of beginning to reunify the veteran's shattered self. The projection of that self into the interpersonal space of the therapy may be the first step in a very long process. Following Winnicott, perhaps it would be still better to say the transitional space of therapy. In this way, the veteran who comes home in a psychically fragmented state, no longer knowing who or she is in relation to himself, herself, or others, can take the first step toward post-traumatic knowledge and blaze a new developmental path forward. And with that, I hand the ball over to one of the real guys, Captain Nate Emery, USMC, retired.
Hello, everybody. I don't know if the video is going to switch on its own as I speak or not, but we've done this a few times now with Doc Barry, and I think what comes out the best, what works in our experience, is that if you have any questions about what Doc is, and just so you know, I refer to him as Doc because to me, he takes care of Marines, takes care of service members, so he's a Doc whether or not he had a PhD. But I'll always refer to him as Doc. But what we found is what works best is when you have your questions, if I can give you the veteran's perspective on it. And also, I just want you to know that I am not adverse to answering any questions you have. And I found that it's been helpful for people, even if it's a question that you normally, would only ask a patient. I'm okay with giving you my honest answer about whatever you may have. Because I know there's questions you may be wondering about, maybe people you speak to or you treat, and you can't exactly ask them because you might have some unintended effects and I am more than happy to answer those types of questions for you. So with that, does anybody have any questions? And I don't think the video is switching. It looks like it's,
Yeah, I hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
I can hear you great.
Yep. I don't see Dean. There's nobody moderating here, and I'm not seeing any typing on the screen, unfortunately. Wait a minute. Here comes, here he is.
You guys are switching back and forth just fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, let me see if I can warm people up, Nate.
Sounds so good.
What, several of my students have been researching this question, and that is, what thing or couple things do you feel was the most helpful for you?
For me, what was most helpful was I had a therapist who she didn't push me. I came in telling her that I was there because I had anger problems. And I had an initial intake with a psychiatrist who quickly, threw that to the side and was able to get down to the core of what was happening in my life. And, the anger issues I was having was anxiety. So when she referred me to the therapist who worked in the same office as her, this was on Fort Belvoir, the Army base, because I was on active duty at the time. But the therapist didn't push me along. She understood what I thought I was there for, and she understood the diagnosis that the psychiatrist had given me. But she let me talk freely, and we went over everything you can think of for about at least a year, talking through what I felt that I needed to be there for. And she was always there to guide, the discussion where it needed to go. But she also asked me about experiences when I would touch on them, but she never pushed me. And it's going to be different for every veteran or every patient, what works best for them. But for me, not being forced to talk about something that I wasn't ready to talk about was very helpful, because it didn't make me feel like I was somebody that was under the microscope being examined. I didn't have to think about, I was never worried about being diagnosed in a way that the book says that I should be. I just felt that she just wanted to know more about me and what I went through, and I don't know. That's what worked. She gained my trust that way.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Valentina. When did you start realizing something was off? What caught your attention about your own behavior, thoughts, etc.?
Well, looking back, what was off is a lot different from what actually I realized at the time. My anxiety had gone up to the point where everything at home was horrible. My marriage was just about at its very end. I was just about to make the decision that, yes, we're going to end this, I'm going to leave. But what I recognized was one day when I was driving to work was that I had been thinking about how I could possibly take my own life without my family losing the insurance money. And, these kinds of things, I think, my assumption is that a lot of people think about stuff like this. If I was going to do this, how would I do it? But I realized that I was kind of formulating a plan. And I was thinking about my kids at the time and how I didn't want them to spend the rest of their lives wondering what had happened. And so for me, it was because I was able to snap out of my own, selfishness or self-centeredness, whatever you would call it, and start thinking about my kids. And on the way to work that day, once I got to work, I didn't walk into the building. I parked at the top of the parking lot and picked up the phone and called the medical there on the Marine Corps base at Quantico. And I started trying to find a way to get help. And at that time, it wasn't very easy. It took me about 2.5 hours to finally get to somebody that I needed to get a hold of who could actually give me an appointment. And I wasn't happy with the initial iteration of it, but that's what got it started and got me to cross the line. And as a side note, what was interesting was after I made that phone call and I made that appointment, I went into work, into the building, and there was hardly anybody there. And I found out what was going on is we had a mandatory suicide awareness class on the base that day. So I went down to the base theater, and I was just thinking, wow, this is really interesting how God is working in my life. And the first thing that was said at the opening of this suicide awareness class, we had I think it was a 1-star general, got up in front of all the Marines before anybody could speak. And he kind of pointed at the crowd because we had a lot of combat veterans in there. And the first thing he said was, if any of you are thinking about taking your own life, you are weak, and that is coward's way out. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, what a way to shut everybody down, to slap any hands that people are reaching out to ask for help. And it didn't stop me. I went into my appointment, which was like 2 weeks later, surprisingly. And I was with a Navy doctor, and I was a little bit shut off because I didn't know, do I want to say things to this other active duty person? I didn't know what would be kept, confidential and what wouldn't. And at that point, I still had a career ahead of me that I didn't know where it was going to go. So, kind of long story, but it was my own self-realization. People around me and my family were telling me that, I had a problem. I was angry all the time. And, I was causing a lot of friction in the family. But for me, I was just fortunate that I finally recognized what they had been saying myself.
Two hours to get an appointment, then a 2-week wait.
Yes. It's much better now.
That's what I hear.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Somehow this is reminiscent of the joke of being put on hold on the suicide hotline,
Yeah.
No joke at all.
I am curious, what happened after the general kind of spits on the whole idea of suicide and getting help? Did the presentation proceed?
Well, it did. And the first 2 people on, well, they were the let's say the whole class was kind of formed around them. It was a father and son, and the father or I should say the son was paralyzed. And what had happened, he had jumped off of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And they continued their brief, but when he started, it was kind of, it was like there was a damper over everything, but it picked up pretty quick. But it was interesting to hear his point of view, because he said the one thing that anyone who survives a suicide attempt probably won't tell you, but they tell each other, is that the moment they make the decision and they step forward to do it, that they immediately regret it. And he said as soon as he went over the side of that bridge, he instantly regretted it. And he doesn't know why he survived it. I think I know why, because he's out talking to veterans and talking to other people about, about suicide and getting help. But yeah, it moved along okay after that, but I don't know how many people, may have never stepped forward to ask for help after he said that. And it just killed me that he didn't see the irony in what he was saying and what we were there for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, that works directly into, what Doc Barry is saying, is you get these leaders that are, that are leading you, telling you, don't be weak, don't ask for help, basically, and that's the exact opposite of what they need.
I don't, it's an interesting, I know it's one that's being promoted now. And it certainly worked with a couple students that were, embedded in units now. And the whole idea of asking, how many people, do you think you were aware, kind of in a right then and there situation, I need to kind of debrief on this one and work this one through a bit, or were you just too busy going?
It was, I was at the lowest point I'd ever been in my life. Everything was falling apart. I was at rock bottom. And it was, I don't know why, I had that moment of clarity to think about my kids, because some of my older kids, our teenagers, we were in conflict with each other. So I wasn't even having such a great time with them. And the idea of how I was going to finally do something was really an escape. It's just didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know what to do from there, and that was the only way out I could see at the time. And the idea of talking to somebody didn't occur to me until that moment. I guess it took me thinking about transferring the pain that I'd be escaping to my kids, and them being in pain. That maybe is what really got me to finally do something about it. I really wasn't doing it for myself at that point. As far as I was concerned, I was doing it for my kids.
Well, you were in leadership positions. If you could re-envision how, from the moment people get in the door throughout their careers, these things are talked about. How would you revision that?
Well, I'd say today, yes, it's very talked about. I came in 1990. A lot of the senior people that were in the Marine Corps with me at the time were Vietnam veterans. So we looked up to them in a different way. We believed that everything we saw on TV was the experience of every single one of them. And we saw how strong they were when we looked at them. So they weren't talking about it as far as we knew. And nobody ever talked about PTSD the first 12, 14 years of my career. It's different now, definitely. I was surprised that when I was out processing, I would ask some of the young Marines as I was retiring. I would ask some of the younger Marines that I didn't know personally, but I'd ask them how things were going, what they were doing, and they're much more open now to talking about it. Maybe not to everybody, but to me, they were telling me exactly what medication they were on and where they were and what units they were in. And because of how small the Marine Corps is, if you talk about particular battles, a lot of Marines will understand, the magnitude of what happened at that point. But they're doing a lot more for it, far more for it now than when I first joined the Marine Corps. When I was young, it was all about just being strong and manning up and doing whatever you needed to get through to the day.
I think you just asked. I think you kind of answered Valentina's question. She asked if is the concept of weakness popular amongst active soldiers and veterans nowadays? Is that?
Well, I've got a little more to add to that, actually. That brings up a really good point, because when you join the military, one of the things you do in boot camp is you learn how to think about everybody and the mission and the whole, right? It's not what you're doing, serving is no longer about yourself. So everything throughout your career is about how do you accomplish the mission first? How do you take care of your people second? I'd say a very distant third was how do you take care of yourself? So the idea of not showing weakness and being strong, you don't want to put doubt in the minds of those people you're leading, right? So it's a difficult balancing act, I think, to be able to show that you are having problems as well, but to be able to show them that you're strong enough to do what needs to be done. Now, there could be the argument of, hey, you're strong enough to be able to ask for help when you need it. But, some people that may draw additional questions of, well, is this guy going to be able to handle, leading us into combat? But right or wrong, I think that's where it comes from. That's take care of everybody else first. I'll worry about me later.
Mm-hmm. While we're waiting for some more questions, you raised another thought, because I've got the two of you on now, because it's certainly been my experience. The whole idea, it's a tension that comes up between the students I know that are military clinicians and the students that are civilian clinicians, or they were military and moved to civilian practices. The whole idea of talking to a uniform versus somebody many steps removed. 'Cause I think both of you hinted on that. Did it feel at all reassuring to be in the context of Fort Belvoir when you
Yeah.
were there?
What was reassuring to me was that the therapist that I had she was there by contract, so she was not in uniform. So I really wasn't. I guess it made me more comfortable to say whatever I needed to say. I also knew that I was going to be retiring, so that helped a bit as well. But I guess knowing that what I was there to talk about wasn't going to go anywhere else, being 100% certain of that, because I didn't ever have to worry about her interjecting as a military leader. It was always a healthcare patient relationship,
Mm-hmm.
and that was very helpful. And some of the things that I experienced in the initial part when I had a couple of my first couple of appointments at Quantico was I never got to see the same person twice. Now maybe that's changed, but for me the continuity of care was a huge thing, and it is actually what ultimately the reason why after about 2.5 years I stopped going in, because my therapist had decided she was going into private practice, and I was feeling better. I mean, I know I'll never be perfectly fine, but the thought of going in to speak to somebody that for the first time and having to start all over and explain to them everything, the fact that they might not even approach it in the same way, was an issue. They may be somebody who decides that they want to push and that, prolonged exposure is going to be the way to help me out, when I know, in my own case, what worked for me. So yeah, that's another nice thing about having a civilian provider is I don't have to worry about my doctor or my therapist suddenly leaving or going on orders and getting replaced with somebody else.
Yeah. Andrew, well, I'm always pushing our members to not be afraid to volunteer for like the Soldiers Project or Give an Hour. Any advice you have for clinicians wanting to take a step into this and start volunteering and seeing veterans?
Soldiers Project comes highly recommended. This is going to sound kind of like an odd way of thinking about it, but when I work with the guys, I take what I like to call the Pete Townsend approach to working with veterans. And what I mean by that is, if there's any of the youngsters out there who have never heard the name Pete Townsend, he was and still is a member of a rock band called The Who. And he's just about one of the best songwriters out there. And what makes him as great a songwriter as he is he listens to his audience, and he empathically reflects back to them who they are, what they are, where they are in their lives. And Townsend is just about the best listener out there, as far as I'm concerned. I thought to myself, now how can I take that idea and try to channel it effectively into working with veterans? Well, listen to them. Take what you're reading in your textbooks, give it some consideration, because there is some good research out there, but think of your patient as your best supervisor. Get your data by listening to who the patient is, what the patient is, where they are in the process. Do not try to, as Nate says, do not try to put your head on their shoulders. They will, if you're a good listener, they will tell you how they need to be worked with. That's the best advice I can give anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Let me throw in one other quick thing too for the real beginners in this, and I suggest this to family members who want to understand what PTSD is. If there's anybody in the audience who has not yet sat through a movie called Saving Private Ryan, I would urgently suggest you all to do that, especially the opening scene, which depicts the Allied soldiers landing on Omaha and Normandy Beach during the D-Day invasion. It is graphic, it is loud, and it is about as accurate as the day is long. And I'm getting that information from guys who were, the folks who were there who saw the movie, as well as combat vets in general. And why I suggest that to not only my fellow clinicians, but the family members of vets is, imagine that, having lived through something like that, number one. Number two, imagine having that as your daily soundtrack. Imagine having flashbacks to that, flashbacks that you can't control. And imagine everything happening, too many things happening all at once in a very short period of time, and not being able to turn it off. Certainly not being able to forget it.
And that's a very valid point. It's something I've told people before is I could be having the best month of my life, but every single day, no matter what happens, I think about Desert Storm. I think about Mogadishu, Somalia. It's not always, something that unnerves me and upsets me, but it's a thought that occurs every single day, no matter what. And it's that thing that pulls you back all the time to being 18, 20 years old in combat. So you walk around in this life, day to day, I work with people who I didn't go to combat with. So they only know what they see. Day to day, I wear a suit and a tie. I work at the Pentagon, and I can be the person that they need me to be at specific meetings to talk about whatever. But they don't see that behind that, almost a facade, that there's this 18, 20-year-old kid who relives everything every single day, whether it's the good things or the bad things, but I can never stop being that person. And there are guys that have been through things that are so much more horrible than what I went, the guys and gals, so much more horrible than any of the things that I went through. I was fortunate enough to never to have anybody that I served with die with me in combat. But I know people that had, half a dozen or so die with them in combat. And people that I've known and served with have died. The people that they served with are going through so much more, and they're reliving those things every single day, whether they talk about it or not. They walk into a room to speak with you. There may be a particular day where they just don't want to talk about anything. It doesn't mean that, you're not doing any good for them. Because in that 50-minute, hour and a half interview or time frame they've got with their therapist, clinician, or psychiatrist, whatever the case may be, they're there. They showed up. There's a burden being unloaded, whether you realize it or not. And when they leave that office, they're going to spend all their time until the next time you see them going through that and living it and thinking about it. So it's always there.
Mm-hmm. Valentina is asking another question. Dr. Berry, could this lack of caring, aware authority figures you mentioned in your paper become a factor in joining the armed forces in the first place? Sounds like what she's saying.
Well, I as I tried to illustrate, some come from backgrounds that are a little dodgy at best. They don't have mothers, or they don't have fathers, or they come from abusive backgrounds, wherever, or neglectful backgrounds, whatever the case may be. So they look on the military as a surrogate family, a replacement. They are hoping for something better, anything better than the circumstances they came from. However, as part of their psychical makeup, they sign on the dotted line, take the oath of enlistment, already with the baggage of either incompetent authority figures, no authority figures, abusive, right from the get-go. Does that sort of answer the question? Or I'm sorry, what was the rest of the question?
Well, I think that's what she was getting at, and it reminded me that a couple of my really good students always try to make sure they ask very early on, why'd you join in the first place? To kind of get a sense of, but also to get a sense of what they hoped for, what these men and women hoped they would get from this experience, and to kind of trace the arc of that, what was hoped for and what they actually got.
Right. Let me just go off on a tangent here. Riff off something that Nate was saying a few minutes ago. When you have a veteran coming in for treatment, as a clinician, the first thing you're going to try to do is to get that veteran to talk about themselves. And guess what? That's the very last thing that they are trained to do. They are much more at home, at least initially, talking about those they served with, which is why I say during an intake, and I will ask for names too. Who'd you serve with?
Mm-hmm.
What were they like? Are they still alive? Did you lose anybody over there?
Mm-hmm.
And I get them talking about their units, what they can say about their, and lastly, and how all of the above impacts them, which is kind of counterintuitive about what a psychological intake is all about. But sometimes that's the protracted way you have to go to get these guys to open up about themselves. As Nate was saying, they think they are trained for the good of the mission, the good of the unit, to think about themselves last. And I would submit that also means talking about themselves last. Get them talking about everything else first, and then turn it slowly at a tolerable pace toward getting them to talk about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because in talking about others, we all often, if I talk about what happened to friends and about things that our unit went through, indirectly, I'm telling you about me, right?
Yeah.
I might not say this is how it affected me, but it gives you the background of what may have happened, and what me or whatever these other veterans, what they went through, so you can get a peek into the experience and how they got to your couch, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And
Any other questions? Come on, I want to hear a pulse out there.
I keep trying to prime.
and I'm completely serious. If there's nothing that you're not going to cross a line with me, because the way I look at it is, no matter what you ask me, it can help you make you a better clinician or a better therapist for somebody else who desperately needs that help. And that's the whole reason why I'm along on this trip with Doc, to going around to speaking to people. It's not about me. It's about trying to help anybody else out there. And the more skills and understanding that all of you may have or may develop, then it's better for all of them. I'm who I am. I'm dealing with what I need to deal with, and you're not going to hurt me at all. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may want to ask.
Well, you ask, and Carol's asking back.
And I think I thought she asked that question earlier, but
She
She did.
yeah, at the time, it wasn't me thinking about I wanted to escape what I had been through. I wasn't going through flashbacks and stuff like that. But my anxiety level overall was, I woke up in the morning anxious every day. My kids and my wife, they knew that something was not right. And the more and more that they pushed and wanted me to get help, and the more I would push back, and I was sure it wasn't about me. So the suicide ideations wasn't about escaping my experiences. It was about escaping the point in my life that I was in. Now, at the time, I didn't understand, the connection about how PTSD was making me an unpleasant person to be around, to live with, and to live with myself. And that's ultimately what, was getting me to that point. But for me, it wasn't to escape memories. It wasn't about escaping things that I had done wrong or other things that other people had done wrong. It was a very different case for me. Does that answer your question?
But I think you're bringing up such an important point for clinicians, Nate, and that is that the present, that distress, because I think that's and Mike was getting at it too. He doesn't like the whole PTSD diagnosis, I think, for a very specific reason. But just feeling miserable in general is enough of a symptom to go to somebody.
Yeah.
And I think we read, in the media and the like, it gets presented very differently. And, that just the anxiety you were experiencing, just feeling miserable, that in itself can be a sign to, let's go get help. It doesn't have to be that outrageous. It can be not feeling good.
It's very true. It's something that's been interesting is after, maybe 4 years after I had first gone to get help, 2 years after I stopped, I started acting out of my sleep. It was something I'd never done. And I don't know if that's something that just over time, happens, or if it's just because I think of things differently. But it's so, I don't want to call it unraveling, but as I peel back layers of my life and as I, get more mature about things and bring more understanding to who I am and where I'm at, it seems like different things are, coming to mind, and whether it's conscious or unconscious. My family definitely notices a difference when I run out of meds and I don't refill them. I think the most I can go is about a month and a half before one of them, my wife or my kids, usually the kids first, will ask me if I'm on my medication or not. While I may feel like nothing has changed, they can definitely see a difference in the anxiety level.
We do have a question came in through the Q&A. I'm interested in the overwhelming anxiety as opposed to severe depression one would expect to see. I'm not sure why we'd expect to see severe depression, but...
Well, let me just do a brief throw in here. Speaking clinically, I think of them as two sides of exactly the same coin. And it's just how it manifests itself in each individual person.
Yeah, from the veteran side, for me, it's hard to discern a difference between the two. I guess it's not so much that I don't understand the question. To me, it's kind of the same thing. That doesn't mean it would be in everybody else's, but for me, it's kind of one and the same.
No, I think it's a very important point because, the way we're taught they're two different things, but when you actually get in there and work with people register it differently. I think maybe that's the way to put it.
And here's another way of thinking about it. Nate, please jump in on this one, but I swear I've run into guys and gals who have been anxious for so long, they don't know they're anxious, or that they've been depressed for so long, they don't know they're depressed, which is a way of saying they think this is normal, but on one level, but on a completely different level, they're being told, hey, there's something wrong here. Maybe you should go get help.
Yeah, that's true, because I didn't think of where I was from day to day as anxiety. It didn't, I didn't say to myself, wow, I'm feeling really depressed and anxious. I didn't recognize that at all. And, I'd say that probably over the last year, 2 years, I've been in what somebody would call, a depressed state, but I'm able to function. It's when the anxiety level gets really high, that things are bad. But as long as I stay on my medication and, if my wife asks me about how I'm doing and I answer and not shut down, that's the difference for me.
Mhm.
I'm sorry if the camera shakes a lot. I've got a cat attacking me.
Well, my dog is itching to get out a toy and start creating mayhem, so I'm trying to keep her at bay with my other hand. I'm noticing the time, and I am eternally grateful to Andrew and Nate for joining us tonight. Again, we will post, we can send out an email blast to everybody that attended. So I know some people want to talk to Mike or talk to Andrew. Is that okay to put your emails out there for people that want consults?
Please do.
Definitely. And if they have questions that they, that come to them later that they want a veteran's perspective on, please, you're not gonna upset my existence by passing that on.
Right.
I'm more than happy to help people out.
And now everything's rolling in, except it's all thank you, and we're getting a lot.
How many people do we have watching us, if that's okay to ask?
We have 15.
15?
Yes, 15.
Okay.
And
0.
what'll happen is this is being recorded. It's going to go up on the website, and we track the viewers over the year, and we've had quite a few viewers. So tonight's attendance is one thing, and the people that are going to be watching it over the next couple of years is another.
Okay.
We've had quite a few viewers, and our goal really is to make a library and a resource library on the SBI page for clinicians. So you're
Somebody
part
can
of
send
our
me
library building.
Yeah, when it gets put up there, if somebody could send me a link to it, that'd be great.
Sure.
Oh yeah. Ray Terr is the moderator with the mostest, and should get it done. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next month when we have Robert Usano, who is Mike mentioned the complete data loss from Vietnam. Bob Batista is a numbers guy, and he is tracking everything possibly tracked, and he's going to summarize what they're learning. And I'm assuming it will not get thrown away this time. It will be put somewhere and safe. And then we'll have a good buddy of mine, Jeff Yarvis, I think down at Fort Sam Houston. He's a clinical social worker and did some very interesting research on this idea. He called it back then subclinical PTSD. Basically, people that are feeling symptomatic, but it certainly doesn't rise to a PTSD level, but people are miserable anyway. So he's got some great data on that. So we hope to see you all back in December. Good night now.
Right.
Okay, we're good. Night all.
Okay, good night. It's
Somebody's recording.
Nate is still recording.
Oh, okay.